I returned to Nashville after 6 weeks in Denver supervising the launch of our company's new regional office. Business trips had become part of my life years ago, and no matter how long I was gone, coming home always felt the same. Brooke would bring Ethan and Sophie to the airport, we'd laugh all the way home, and for a little while work disappeared. That afternoon, no one came. I stood outside the terminal with my suitcase for nearly 20 minutes, checking my phone, convinced they'd been caught in traffic. Brooke didn't answer my calls. My texts went unread. Eventually, I booked a rideshare and tried to convince myself something unexpected had happened. When I unlocked the front door, the house was quiet. Ethan sat on the couch staring at the television. He glanced at me for a second before looking back at the screen. "Hey, Dad." That was all. Sophie came halfway down the stairs, gave me a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, quietly said hello, and disappeared upstairs without another word. I found Brooke in the kitchen. She looked at me for only a moment before returning to the vegetables she was cutting. "So," she said without emotion, "was your trip worth it?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" She shrugged without looking at me. "Nothing." The silence that followed settled over the house like a winter storm. Nobody argued. Nobody welcomed me home either. Standing there with my suitcase still beside me, I realized something had changed while I was gone. I just didn't know what it was yet. Before that trip, I would have described my marriage as ordinary in the best possible way. Brooke and I had been together for 16 years and married for 12. We weren't the couple posting romantic photos every weekend or trying to convince the world everything was perfect. We simply built a life one routine at a time. I worked as a regional operations manager, which meant occasional travel, while Brooke worked remotely as a marketing consultant from the office we'd converted out of our spare bedroom. Our schedules weren't always easy, but they fit together well enough. Most evenings ended around the dinner table. Ethan talked about soccer, Sophie complained about homework, and Brooke usually laughed at something that had happened during one of her client meetings. Weekends belonged to youth sports, grocery shopping, backyard barbecues, and whenever we could manage it, trips to my parents' cabin in northern Michigan. It wasn't exciting, but it felt solid. I believed solid was enough. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs I ignored because they arrived one at a time. Brooke stopped leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. She carried it from room to room, even if she was only making coffee. If a message arrived, she'd angle the screen away before reading it. She also became unusually interested in my travel schedule. She wanted exact flight numbers, hotel names, meeting times, and when I expected to return home. At the time, I told myself she was simply trying to plan around the kids' activities. It sounded reasonable, so I never questioned it. I believed strong marriages survived difficult seasons. I trusted the life we'd built together, never imagining it had already begun quietly unraveling behind my back. For the first few days after I came home, I kept telling myself everyone was simply adjusting to my return. 6 weeks was a long time, especially for teenagers. I buried myself in work, answered emails, unpacked my suitcase, and tried to ignore the growing distance inside my own house. But every conversation felt rehearsed, every smile forced. The silence wasn't temporary anymore. It had become part of our daily routine. 3 evenings later, I needed to print several travel receipts for my expense report. The printer was connected to the family tablet, which everyone used from time to time. When I opened it, I noticed Brooke had forgotten to sign out of her cloud account. I wasn't searching for anything personal. I simply clicked through the folders looking for the scanner app. Instead, I found an old synchronized backup that hadn't been deleted correctly. Inside were archived conversations marked for removal months earlier. The name at the top stopped me cold. Tyler Grant. Brooke had dated him before we met. She once described him as someone she'd left firmly in the past. The messages told a different story. They weren't casual conversations between old friends. They were intimate, detailed, and impossible to misunderstand. They talked about hotel reservations, weekends together while I was traveling, and how carefully they had to plan around my work schedule. My hands shook as I reached for my phone to photograph the screen. Before I could save more than a few images, every folder suddenly disappeared. A notification flashed across the tablet. Remote session ended. Brooke had seen the login alert. That was the moment I stopped asking whether something was wrong. I started asking how long I had been living inside a lie. I confronted Brooke the following evening after the kids had gone upstairs. I didn't accuse her immediately. I simply asked whether Tyler Grant was still part of her life. She stared at me for several seconds before setting her phone on the counter. There was no panic in her face, no desperate attempt to deny what I'd seen. She admitted the affair had happened, then quietly added that it was already over, as though that somehow reduced the damage. What shocked me wasn't the confession. It was how little regret she showed while making it. Then the conversation became even colder. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. She told me that if I filed for divorce, Ethan and Sophie would never choose me. They already believed I'd been cheating during my business trips. She explained it almost casually. For months, she had created fake text messages, arranged phone calls with a friend pretending to be my mistress, and allowed the children to overhear carefully planned conversations. Every business trip had become another piece of evidence in a story she invented. By the time I returned from Denver, they no longer questioned it. They simply accepted that their father had another life whenever he left Nashville. I expected anger to take over. Instead, everything inside me became strangely quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call her names. I didn't try to defend myself against accusations she had already planted. Something fundamental had broken beyond repair. At that moment, I stopped fighting for our marriage. From that day forward, my only goal became finding the truth, preserving it, and waiting until the facts could speak louder than every lie she had carefully constructed. I stopped reacting and started observing. Brooke mistook my silence for defeat, and with each passing week, she grew more confident. She rejected every suggestion of counseling, insisting there was nothing left to discuss. Around the house, she treated me like a temporary guest instead of her husband. Sometimes she reminded me that no judge, no friend, and certainly not our children would ever believe my version of events. I never argued. Every time she tried to provoke me, I answered with the same calm expression. She believed she was winning because she couldn't see what I had quietly begun doing behind the scenes. I requested copies of every airline itinerary from the previous 2 years. My company provided security logs showing when I entered and left each regional office. Hotel invoices confirmed every overnight stay, while archived meeting photographs placed me exactly where I claimed to be on the dates Brooke insisted I had been with another woman. I downloaded GPS histories from my company vehicle, gathered expense reports, and organized everything into dated folders. Every document removed another piece of the fiction she had built. A week later, I bought a small digital recorder and slipped it into my jacket pocket whenever difficult conversations seemed likely. I wasn't searching for revenge anymore. Revenge depended on anger, and I had already left that behind. I wanted something much simpler than punishment. I wanted reality preserved exactly as it happened, without exaggeration, emotion, or interpretation. Eventually, the truth would have to compete with manipulation, and when that day arrived, I intended to be ready with facts instead of accusations. While I was quietly documenting the truth at home, the rest of my life continued moving forward whether I was ready or not. At work, I found myself spending more time with Emily Carter, one of the architects assigned to several of our renovation projects. She had finalized her own divorce only months earlier after discovering her husband's affair. We rarely discussed our personal lives in detail, yet there was an honesty about her that reminded me how normal conversation was supposed to feel. Nothing about our friendship was hidden, and nothing needed to be. We simply respected each other, and after months of living inside deception, that felt strangely unfamiliar. At home, the distance between me and my children kept growing. Ethan answered questions with one-word responses, while Sophie avoided being alone with me whenever she could. Teachers began mentioning that they noticed tension during school events whenever I attended. My parents eventually asked whether Brooke and I were having problems because the children no longer seemed excited about our weekends at the cabin. Even neighbors who had known us for years commented that I looked distracted and unusually quiet. They couldn't see the reason, but they recognized the change. What had begun as one person's betrayal had spread far beyond our marriage. It reached my relationship with my children, my parents, my friends, and even the people who only knew us from across the street. I realized I wasn't simply trying to save my reputation anymore. I was trying to reclaim the life manipulation had slowly taken away. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening after I dropped Ethan and Sophie at my parents' cabin for the weekend. They were looking forward to fishing with their grandfather, and for the first time in months the house would be quiet. Before walking inside, I slipped the small digital recorder into my jacket pocket and made sure it was running. I wasn't trying to trap Brooke. I was giving the truth one chance to exist without interruption. She was sitting in the living room when I came in. We talked calmly, almost like two strangers discussing someone else's marriage. I asked why she had convinced the children that I had been unfaithful. She didn't hesitate. She said she couldn't risk losing them if we divorced, and making me the villain had been the safest way to guarantee they stayed with her. Then she smiled in a way I had never seen before. She actually laughed and told me that nobody would ever hear the real story because the children trusted her completely. According to Brooke, perception mattered more than facts, and by the time anyone questioned her version, it would already be too late. I never raised my voice. I never threatened her. When she finished speaking, I simply nodded and thanked her for finally being honest with me. She looked almost confused by my reaction, expecting anger instead of gratitude. I wished her a good night, walked upstairs, and removed the recorder from my pocket. Brooke never realized she had just handed me the one thing months of documents could never provide, her own voice admitting everything willingly. That Saturday afternoon, I asked Ethan and Sophie to walk with me down to the lake behind my parents' cabin. The water was calm, the dock was empty, and for a while none of us spoke. They believed I wanted another chance to deny what they already accepted as truth. Ethan crossed his arms. Sophie stared at the water instead of looking at me. I understood why. Brooke had spent months shaping their opinions, and I couldn't erase that with promises alone. Without saying much, I placed a folder on the picnic table beside us. Inside were airline records, hotel invoices, company security logs, GPS reports, meeting photographs, and expense reports covering every business trip Brooke had questioned. Then I played the recording from my phone. They listened without interrupting. Brooke's voice filled the silence as she admitted creating fake messages, staging phone calls, and convincing them I had been the unfaithful parent because she feared losing them in a divorce. When the recording ended, nobody moved. Several long minutes passed before Sophie covered her face and began crying. Ethan kept staring at the table until his shoulders dropped. Finally, he looked at me and quietly apologized for every cold conversation, every accusation, and every time he had turned away when I came home. I didn't ask either of them to choose between their parents. I simply told them the truth belonged to all of us now. That same afternoon, I called my attorney and asked him to reopen the divorce case. For the first time in over a year, I felt like I was walking toward the future instead of defending the past. The divorce no longer felt like an act of revenge. By the time the paperwork began moving through the court, our marriage had already ended in every way that truly mattered. The legal process simply acknowledged what Brooke's choices had made inevitable months before. I attended each meeting with my attorney calmly, answered every question honestly, and relied on evidence instead of emotion. There was nothing left to prove through arguments because the truth had already spoken for itself. Ethan and Sophie agreed to begin family therapy with me. I never asked them to forgive anyone, including their mother. I only wanted them to have a place where they could ask difficult questions without feeling pressured to defend either parent. Week after week, our conversations became more natural. We laughed again over dinner, watched old movies together, and returned to my parents' cabin without the uncomfortable silence that had followed us for so long. Trust wasn't restored overnight, but every honest conversation became another step toward rebuilding it. Brooke continued insisting she had acted out of fear rather than cruelty. She searched for explanations that might soften what she had done, but I discovered I no longer needed them. Understanding her motives wouldn't change the choices she had made or the damage they caused. I stopped measuring my future against my past. The truth had already done its work, and for the first time since returning from Denver, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Peace. I kept my friendship with Emily private because my children had already endured enough confusion. Whatever the future might hold between us could wait. They deserved time to heal without wondering whether someone else had replaced their mother. Emily understood that without me having to explain it. Her patience reminded me that healthy relationships never demand impossible choices. Looking back, I no longer define my story by Brooke's affair or the divorce that followed. Those events changed my life, but they no longer control it. What matters most is that Ethan and Sophie know the truth, and that our relationship was rebuilt on honesty instead of manipulation. I finally learned there is a difference between fighting for a marriage and fighting for the people you love. Sometimes those battles are not the same. Staying silent isn't always weakness or surrender. Sometimes silence gives the truth enough room to reveal itself, and once it does, you never have to raise your voice again.
That's the end of the story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos for you, so pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.